Hi, welcome to Exploring the Illusion of Free Will. My name is George Ortega, and this is June 2nd, 2014, episode number 159, Free Will, Refutation, Cost, Climate Change Denial, Part 2. Okay, and so basically in this series, which may take, who knows, 10, 20 episodes, because we're going to go through this book page by page. I just published a book called Free Will, Its Refutation, Societal Cost, and Role in Climate Change Denial, that while it's a brief book, it's only 56 pages, I crafted it as a scholarly work. It's got 50 citations. You know, it's not really for the popular audience, but basically the premise of this book is that understanding that free will is an illusion isn't just a philosophical, interesting truth that doesn't really have consequences. What I do in this book is that I implicate free will belief in climate change denial. In other words, like about 44% of people here in the United States believe that climate change is happening and that we're causing it, meaning that 66% are in denial about it. And so part of what I propose in this book, my hypothesis, my theory, is that much of this denial is explained through the free will belief. In other words, very briefly, in order to be in denial about something, denial is like an unconscious process that we resort to when we feel really bad, really we're threatened by some information. It threatens who we believe we are. And we begin to feel guilty about what we're being indicted with. So in this case, we're being indicted with causing the climate change that is threatening, you know, the lives of billions of people over the next decades, you know, over the next centuries, really. So because people can't handle that, they deny that climate change is happening. And so the premise of this book is like, in order to feel guilty about something, you first have to believe you have a free will. If you understand that you don't have a free will, yeah, you might say, fine, we do wrong things, but you don't feel guilty about it. Like, for example, I understand that I'm part of this, you know, of humanity's contributing to climate change. You know, we all contribute, right? But because I understand that we don't have a free will, I don't blame myself. I don't blame others. And as a result, I don't feel guilty. And as a result of not feeling, it's not that I'm not conscientious about it, and that that I don't believe it's very important to do as much as we can about it, because actually that's the purpose of the book. But because I don't feel personally guilty, because I don't believe in free will, that means that I don't really go into denial about it. I'm able to face it, you know, squarely and objectively. And so, like, to the extent that that people are able to understand that free will is an illusion, we can address this climate change denial, which is right now actually what's preventing us from successfully taking meaningful steps at adapting to it and mitigating it, you know, which is very, very important. We have to do much more. All right, so that's the basic premise. And I went through a basic outline of the book in the last episode, so it's probably up on YouTube by now. So we're on page 2. Because again, I'm going to go through this like page by page. So basically, before implicating free will belief in not just climate change denial, but a host of personal and social harms, like, you know, more blame, more vengeance, more anger, more aggression, more violence, more depression. You know, I go through some research that links those behaviors to blaming behavior, and then naturally the link is between blaming behavior and free will belief. So basically, before I do that, I present 5 proofs of the causality that refutes free will. In other words, like the harm that free will belief does to our world, and, you know, in provoking, in encouraging climate change denial, is predicated on understanding that the benefit of this understanding, you have to understand that free will is an illusion before you can really appreciate, you know, the value of understanding that free will is an illusion. You know, in other words, like, before you can appreciate the harm that it does and its role in climate change denial, you have to pretty much be convinced that free will is an illusion. So that's what the first part of the book is. And I'm going to read this because it basically presents what I'll be going through in the next chapter, which is chapter 2, Causality and Free Will. So basically it says, free will is prohibited by a causal principle that is A, universal and a priori, B, necessary to quantum mechanical prediction, C, required by the law of conservation of momentum, D, necessary to the scientific method, and E, a result of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, HUP, and evident in simultaneous particle position and momentum measurement. Okay, so basically this part of the book that'll be the next chapter is going to get into the deep physics of this. And to many people it may not be necessarily accessible, but again, I wrote this book not really for the general public. I wrote this book for the academics, for physicists, for psychologists, for philosophers, who if they don't understand the physics themselves, then they can consult with their colleagues to get a better understanding of why causality, is a fact of nature and how it refutes free will. Okay, then in addition to that, some people say that no, not everything is cause. So I refute that, and they say that some things are indeterministic or random or acausal or causa sui or ex nihilo. These are different terms to describe certain mechanisms that people have proposed. So the other thing that I do in this book is that I say, well, even if you were right, you're not, because basically causality is so fundamental, it's a priori, you can't, it's indisputable. But even if things were uncaused, or even if our decisions caused themselves, or if nature was fundamentally indeterministic, or if reality arose ex nihilo, even if that was the case, that wouldn't present a case for free will, because for example, if a decision is uncaused, you can't attribute it to a human being. If a decision is causing itself, again, you can't attribute it to a human being. So anyway, I go through these various kinds of mechanisms that have been proposed. Okay, and so the four articles that I'll be reviewing, because after that section of explaining why causality refutes free will and explaining causality as a priori, what I just went through, then I'm going to be reviewing 4 articles that have been published by philosophers, in one case a doctor, in 2 cases psychologists, or 2 cases philosophers, 1 psychologist. So the 4 articles that I'm going to be reviewing are Baumeister 2008, and the title of that article is Free Will in Scientific Psychology, and it was published in Perspectives on Psychological Science in 2008. Okay, that's the first article. Then there's another one by a philosopher named Fingeret, and he also published his article in 2008, and it was called Free Choice, and it was published in Current Psychology. Okay, and then the third article that I review is by a philosopher named Mealy, and he published his article in 2012, and it's called Another Scientific Threat to Free Will, ? And it's published in Monist. And these are all peer-reviewed journals. They're professional journals. They're not standard popular magazines. And I shouldn't be going through all this, I guess, now, but might as well. One more. The other one is by an MD. His name is Mayer, and he published his article in 2011. And the title of his article is Free Will an Illusion? ? And it's published in Ethics and Medicine. Okay, so basically what I do is I just present their articles, quoting them when I need to, because I think when they're presenting their defenses of free will, it's important that I describe them accurately. So I quote them, as necessary, and then I apply this principle of causality to what they claim defends free will, basically refuting it by this general understanding that everything has a cause, that causality refutes free will. Okay, and so then after that, basically as I said, there's a couple of researchers, Vohs and Schuler, who in 2008 they became afraid. See, like back in 1983, this guy, Benjamin Libet, he published an experiment where he asked people to flex their wrist or their finger, right? But he asked the subjects in this experiment that, like, the moment that you decide that you're going to do this, you know, notice it on a clock and then let us know. Let the research or the experimenters know, okay? So they did this, right? And what they found was that motor activity, because they had these subjects hooked up to a functional MRI or an EEG that measured their brain waves, that measured the electrical activity that determined when they were conscious of making the decision, or, you know, the unconscious activity at the time, and they used an electromyogram to measure the muscle activity of when the actual motion took place. And what they discovered is that the unconscious had already initiated motor activity for the flexing of the wrist or the finger about 300 milliseconds before the person reported being consciously aware of making the decision. Okay, so essentially, like, the unconscious had already made the decision before the subjects reported being conscious of it. Now, you might say 300 milliseconds is not very much, but, like, as I'll get into later in the book somewhat, back in 2008, a team of researchers replicated the experiment, and in their experiment they found that actually the unconscious was initiating motor activity between 7 and 10 full seconds before the subjects were aware of their decision to move. I don't remember exactly what the behavior was in that decision, but basically 7 seconds before their conscious decision to act. So anyway, so like that was one research. And then Bargh, this guy John Bargh of Yale, he did priming experiments where he basically primed. Priming is a way to induce someone toward a certain behavior without their knowledge of the manipulation. For example, they would put a picture of a library in a room, and they noticed when that happened, people spoke more softly in the room. And so what happens is, like, people aren't aware of the manipulation. It's on a subconscious level. And if you ask them, well, why did you speak so softly? They'd invent a reason. They wouldn't, you know, they wouldn't be aware that it was because of this picture of a library on the wall. All right, so that was another one. And then this Wegner, Daniel Wegner, who unfortunately just died a couple of years ago, I believe, he pioneered this. In 2002, he published this pivotal landmark book called The Illusion of Conscious Will, where he just, like, cited study after study after study, demonstrating that so many of the decisions and acts we generally attribute to our conscious will are actually performed at the level of the unconscious. I mean, a powerful book. And then, so anyway, because of this research, these psychologists, Vohs and Schuler, in 2008, they became concerned. They say, wait a minute, you know, like, all this evidence that we don't have free will, they were afraid the society was going to collapse. They were afraid that if people begin to understand that nobody has a free will, that absolutely nothing is fundamentally up to us, people are going to say to themselves, well, that means I can do whatever I want, and you can't hold me accountable. You can't hold me responsible because I don't have a free will. It's not really my fault. So they're afraid that our society is going to go completely collapse, that, you know, anarchy is going to reign and all. So they began to, like, first, I have a feeling these researchers actually at first attempted to defend free will. But once they realized that was futile, because the evidence against free will was so unequivocal, you know, then their next tack, their next strategy, well, let's see if we can kind of, like, convince the world that actually believing in free will is better or is more useful than disbelieving. So what they did, they constructed an experiment. Again, I'm going to go into it in much more detail later, but their experiment, they induced, they primed, they used this protocol that Bargh used, you know, the priming, inducing people to certain beliefs. So they induced people to believe that they didn't have free will, and then they had a control group, or they primed another group to believe that they did have free will, and then they tested them on a cheating experiment in the laboratory. So they found, in this experiment, like they had 20 trials, and the unfree will belief group cheated out of 20 trials an average of 12 times, whereas the free will belief group, or the control group, cheated an average of about 9 times. So there isn't even that much difference between the two. But like in this book, in the chapter on the research, I just basically demonstrate that the research, the methodology is actually flawed in various ways. The experiment was not, they did 2 experiments. They were not designed well, they were biased, and they reached the wrong conclusions. And furthermore, that like testing this, the benefits or detriments of believing in free will with an artificial experiment like this is really not the way to go. So I actually propose a more effective way to deal with this, to understand this, as well as like citing a lot of research that suggests very strongly that the blame that is required, in other words, like, in order to feel blame, to blame someone, you have to believe that they have free will. So this blame that results from free will belief is associated with a lot of harm in society. Increased aggression, increased depression, increased anxiety, increased violence. So basically, I refute Vohs scholars' contention that disbelief in free will is harmful, and I actually make a very strong case that belief in free will is far more harmful than disbelief in free will. And finally, like in the chapter after that, I just go into like how belief in free will is, again, the premise of this book, causing or initiating the guilt and the denial that's to a great extent responsible for the climate change denial that's stopping us from doing as much as we can. All right, so let's see, we're on page 3. And now, so in this chapter 2, Causality and Human Will, I basically go, this is going to be physics, okay? And so like, again, if you don't really understand it, you may have to watch it a few times. You may need to do a bit of research. But it's not all that complicated, but, you might, need to just get a grounding in some of the concepts that I'll try to explain them. But all right, so like, basically I start out with a simple, basic refutation of free will. I'll read this. Refuting free will is straightforward. A, everything is caused. B, human thoughts are caused. C, the antecedent causes of human thoughts regress to before the person's birth. And D, therefore, human thoughts are not fundamentally attributable to a human free will. So that's the outline. That's why free will is impossible. Causality makes free will impossible. Okay, so like again, some people, some philosophers, some psychologists have said, wait a minute, like they don't believe that everything is caused. And when you think about it, what does it mean? Like if something isn't caused, how does it come about? It's an absurd prospect logically, but some people, in an effort to defend free will because they need to believe it, because they fear that like if they didn't have a free will, if they understood it, then life would be less meaningful or something. Some people like interpret this in different ways. But anyway, they, for various motivations, they were making the point that, well, no, like some events, like human choices, they are not causal. But all right, so again, if they're not causal, that would mean they are acausal or they're uncaused. And if a decision is uncaused, you can't logically, scientifically, in any other kind of manner, attribute it to anything, including a human will. Okay, so that's what this page is about. And then again, like they say, well, there could be other mechanisms that might explain free will. Like some of them propose that that this mechanism is neither causal nor acausal. It's not about things being caused and it's not about things being uncaused. It's about things causing themselves. In Latin, there's a phrase called causa sui, and it means the cause of itself. And so essentially, this philosopher Galen Strawson in 1994, I might as well refer to his work here. He basically wrote an article, The Impossibility of Ultimate Responsibility in Philosophical Studies, where he makes the case that nothing can be causa sui, nothing can be the cause of itself. Okay, so basically he explains how, like, causa sui, proposing that some things cause themselves, is not going to defend free will. Again, think about it. If a decision that we make is causing itself, that means we're not causing it. It is causing itself. So that doesn't defend free will. Or some people postulate that, well, some things in reality just occur out of nothing. There's a certain kind of like an understanding of the universe. It doesn't really make sense because, one of the fundamental laws of nature is that mass energy can neither be created nor destroyed. So the concept of something coming out of nothing really just, is prohibited by this fundamental law of nature. But, some people propose that, that our decisions arise ex nihilo. Again, another Latin term meaning out of nothing. But think about it. If our decisions were to have arise that way, we would be attributing them to nothing. Nothing caused them, however, absurd or illogical that is. In other words, we can't be attributed something that is arising ex nihilo, out of nothing. Okay, so basically that covers all the different kinds of attempts to defend free will in light of the preponderant evidence that causality does govern the universe, and that it governs every aspect of the universe, including every human act we do, including every decision. All right, we're on page 4. And so, what happens? So, I start out with, Newton. Isaac Newton, brilliant scientist. In 1687, he published his, let me see if I can, because it's in Latin, the Principia Mathematica. It's called the Principia, and it's got, Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica. That's kind of like my gobbled up Latin, but in English, it's like the Principia Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, okay? And in it, he kind of proposes the laws of nature, the fundamental laws of nature, that they're deterministic. In other words, he basically says that everything has a cause, that if we understand the causes for, the planets moving, for objects on the earth moving, then we can predict their behavior. We can understand their behavior. Okay, so basically, he invoked what's known as determinism. Now here's the thing, and I'm not going to be able to get so into it in this chapter in this episode. We've got a little under 4 minutes, but I'll introduce it, and then I'll just reiterate it again at the beginning of the next episode. The problem is that. All right. Basically, what Newton was describing is described as determinism, and so basically determinism is an explanation of causality that links it to prediction. Let me see how to explain this. All right, another famous, I think he was a statistician, mathematician, Simon de Pierre Laplace in 1814, he wrote his own book, and it is called, A Philosophical Essay on Probabilities, okay? Pierre Simon Laplace. And basically he described causality, okay? He starts out by describing causality, and he says, I quote, "The present events are connected with preceding ones by a tie based upon the evident principle that a thing cannot occur without a cause which produces it." Okay, basically he's describing causality. Nothing can happen without it being caused. Okay, so that's so he presents that, and that, Newton is kind of uses that in his Principia to explain the motion of objects, his laws of motion. Okay, so Laplace says that on page 3 of his book. But here's the thing. What created a lot of confusion about this, the present confusion, is that people began to conflate determinism, or the prediction that's theoretically possible as a result of causality, with the causality itself. And in essence, people said, well, if everything is caused, that means we should be, in principle, be able to predict everything, and I'll get into that. And in a certain sense, while that is correct, but we'd have to know everything about, let's say, the universe to be able to predict completely accurately the future or know the past completely. And the problem is, in 1927, the guy named Heisenberg came up with what is known as the Heisenberg uncertainty principle that demonstrates quite accurately that we can never obtain that knowledge, because what he says is we can't, the laws of nature, invoking this constant in nature called Planck's constant, it prohibits us from simultaneously measuring the position and momentum of a particle. And because of that, we don't have access to all the information we need to make completely accurate predictions. But the key that I'll get into in this next episode, because I've got under a minute, is that just the fact that prediction is prohibited does not mean that the motion, the behavior of particles is not being caused. Okay, some people conflated causality with its correlate of prediction and reached the wrong conclusion that if it can't be predicted, maybe it's not causal. I'm going to explain how that conclusion was completely wrong. Okay, we got 20 seconds on. Thanks for watching. Again, we're on page 4. The book is Free Will, Its Refutation, Societal Cost, and Role in Climate Change Denial. And I'll be back to explain more on the next episode. Thanks for watching.